Mounting international concern over the India-Pakistan conflict as both are armed with substantial nuclear arsenals. Atomic bombs have only been used twice, 80 years ago on Japan. What nuclear risks do the current hostilities pose? This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm James Bays. A shooting attack killing Indian tourists in Kashmir last month, blamed by India on Pakistan, which it denies has escalated into a conflict now causing deepening international anxiety. That's because it pits two nuclear powers in direct confrontation. Each has a vast army, India estimated to have more than 5 million military personnel compared to 1.7 million for Pakistan. But it's their non-conventional firepower that's of most international concern. India began nuclear tests in the 1970s, declaring itself a nuclear power in 1998. Pakistan followed suit shortly afterwards. They've had wars before, but never have resorted to the use of their most lethal weapons of mass destruction. So what capability do they have? And is there any danger of nuclear weapons being used? We'll talk to our panel of guests in a moment, but first this report from Laura Khan.
This is the aftermath of a sharp and dangerous escalation between neighbours. Scores of people injured after cross-border shelling between India and Pakistan.
Pakistan resorted to heavy shelling around 2:30 this morning, so we had to run away. 4 of my houses were burned.
India is targeting areas in Pakistan it says are linked to the armed group involved in an attack against tourists in late April, while Pakistan accuses India of igniting an inferno in the region. But for many, a bigger threat looms. The two countries have been locked in a nuclear arms race for decades, keeping the size of their respective stockpiles shrouded in secrecy. Think tanks estimate India and Pakistan possess more than 170 nuclear warheads each. India has a no-first-use policy, meaning it will only deploy the weapons as retaliation, whereas Pakistan has not ruled out first use if it's under existential threat. Islamabad is known to have short and medium-range ballistic missiles and relies mostly on China for stocks and technical support, while Delhi is known to have longer-range missiles and a nuclear triad, meaning it can strike from land, air and sea. It's been buying billions of dollars in equipment from the West, including the US. And so far, the superpowers have been calling for calm. In India, the latest headlines have been ramping up war rhetoric against their neighbour.
If there are military attacks on us, there should be no doubt that it will be met with a very, very firm response.
And Pakistan's Prime Minister also had fighting words.
We pledge that the blood of every fallen martyr will be avenged. The coward enemy targeted innocent civilians and showed themselves as mighty and brave. But last night, by Almighty's grace, we gave them a befitting response in our own way to the enemy.
The escalating hostilities have set the region on edge. And on the world stage, the nuclear capability of both is stoking global alarm. Laura Khan, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Well, a very complex subject today, but you don't need to be a nuclear scientist to understand it because we've got a panel of guests who are going to make it accessible. We're joined from Stockholm by Dan Smith, the director of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, a think tank focusing on global security. In Utrecht, Susi Snyder, programme coordinator at the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. And in Washington, D.C., Elizabeth Threlkeld, a senior fellow and director of the South Asia programme at the Stimson Centre. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us today on the programme. Well, this is an issue, and on this programme we try to avoid scaremongering, Susi. But when you listen to the current rhetoric from both sides and you realise how much nuclear firepower they have, this is a scary subject, isn't it?
It absolutely is a scary subject because the thing with nuclear weapons is they are indiscriminate and they cause grave harm, and it's harm that that can last generations. And that is a terrible problem. And it's why most countries don't have nuclear weapons. And it's why there's a huge urge for restraint right now between India and Pakistan, because wherever a nuclear weapon is used, if there is one that will be used, it would harm both Indians and Pakistanis. And that's something that I think no one wants.
Elizabeth, though, the other side of the argument is that India and Pakistan have had numerous clashes since right at the beginning, since the two countries were created on the same day. They've all ended eventually with de-escalation and no resort to the nuclear option.
That's right. And I think there are a few factors we can point to there. One is the role of external crisis managers. So the U.S. and other countries coming in to try to facilitate, pull both sides back from the brink, right? Another is the role of luck, to be honest. You look back historically, and we've had a number of lucky breaks that, had they gone a different way, it might have been more difficult to control escalation. And then a third that I think we do need to recognize here is, both sides see themselves and each other as rational actors. And I think there is an implicit sense that neither side wants things to escalate. And so what I worry most about is not that one side will deliberately choose to do something on purpose that could risk nuclear use, but instead it's that we could kind of fall into it in some way, someone accidentally, inadvertently, right? And I think that's the situation we're in and what we need to be most mindful of.
Dan, when you heard Elizabeth speak there, one of the points she made was the role of luck. Well, that's not very inspiring, is it? How worried and concerned are you?
Yes, I agree that we have had some luck in the past on this and on other issues where, as a globe, as a world, we have come frighteningly close to the use of nuclear weapons, and you could think that it is good fortune which has kept us safe. But I think it is very important to emphasize what Elizabeth also just said, which is the rationality. I mean, it would be stupid of either government to launch a nuclear attack on the other. But what might happen is through escalation in action and in rhetoric as well, that there is something happens that is misinterpreted, miscommunication, and then suddenly the luck turns against us. If you wanted me to put a percentage on it, I would put a pretty low percentage on the risk. I mean, I think it is way short of probable that nuclear weapons are used, but that does not mean it's impossible. And the hope must be that if the two countries can get beyond this crisis, then they can get to a safer form of relationship with them between each other, because the undefined border between the two countries of Jammu and Kashmir is a running sore for the past nearly 80 years, and it's a problem that really needs to be solved.
Susi, you've heard both the other panellists talking about the risk of stumbling into a nuclear war by mistake or miscalculation. Give us an idea of the possible scenarios there.
So both sides have nuclear armed missiles, but the missiles themselves are dual capable. That means that they could be armed with conventional weapons. And here's the thing with a missile. You don't actually know what the warhead on it is until it lands. And so when you're detecting the incoming missile, if you're a little bit trigger happy, or if you're quite nervous, as people are human and people are in a highly tense conflict situation, and might be misinterpreted to be a nuclear armed missile coming in. And then a response could be firing other nuclear armed missiles, and that could quickly escalate. And one of the great risks around nuclear weapons in particular is once they are introduced, that risk of escalation to all-out nuclear war is what is most likely. And it's what has been sort of gamed out over and over and over. And this region, because of the tension between India and Pakistan, because it's a known nuclear flashpoint, a lot of modeling has been done on what those impacts could look like. And it would not stay in India and Pakistan. And that's the thing, because what's likely is if you use nuclear weapons, they kick up a lot of soot into the atmosphere. And that soot blocks out sunlight. It has an impact on agriculture. And long-term impacts of even a small exchange of nuclear weapons between India and Pakistan could have a massive impact on food security for the entire globe. If they each use just a fraction of their current arsenal, that could affect hundreds of millions around the world. And that's a reason for everyone to be concerned. Again, the likelihood is not high, but the probability is not zero. And if the probability is not zero, we should take action to prevent the escalation into nuclear war and to make sure that things like the hotline between the two are still working, that there are good communications, and even in times of crisis, you can still communicate and commit to not introducing nuclear weapons to this conflict.
Dan, I'd like to drill down on the nuclear capabilities of these two countries a little more in a moment, but your organisation, SIPRI, looks at militaries around the world. Tell us about their conventional militaries in terms of their military budgets and the size of these militaries. I think perhaps not surprising that India, being the most populous country in the world, just above China, 1.46 billion people, has a bigger military than Pakistan with a population of 247 million. But both are vast, are they not?
Yes, I mean, I think the number that was given in your report to begin, the 5 million in Indian armed forces, includes a lot that whom one would normally think of as being paramilitary. But these are really large armed forces. They are amongst the biggest in the world. Certainly, India's is bigger, way bigger than Russia's. And Pakistan is on that scale, or maybe a bit more as well. So these are formidable armed forces. I think the additional thing to say is that one assesses an armed forces not only by the numbers of people and by the amount of equipment, and they have both got, I mean, the sophisticated military equipment, both in heavy weapons and in communications and so on. Also, you assess it in terms of their proven combat capabilities. And both armed forces are hardened in combat. There has been war. There's internal wars in both countries. Pakistan has been on security alert for years on its northern border because of Afghanistan, and it has the uprising in Baluchistan, which has been going on for years. India also has internal security insurgencies and uprising, internal security problems. And of course, the two countries have been at war with each other 4 times since independence. Most recently, in what you might call a proper war, in 1999, but with a continuing series of armed clashes across the border since then. So these are capable armed forces, large and with governments, states that have a tradition of being ready to use armed force if they see it as being necessary.
And Elizabeth, if you could perhaps add to that, tell us where they're getting their weapons from. Where are the main suppliers for these two nations?
Yeah, it's a key question, and one that I think we're see play out in interesting ways already on the battlefield. So over the past several years, we've seen a deepening in Pakistan's defense relationship with China. China has been a longtime partner and supporter of Pakistan, but Pakistan's acquisition of Chinese military hardware has accelerated significantly over the past several years. And China was also a key supporter of Pakistan as it developed its nuclear capabilities. And so reportedly, right, we're still seeing actual confirmation come through on this, but certainly Pakistan at this point is claiming that it used some of those Chinese assets to apparently down Indian French origin fighter jets. Again, I really want to emphasize that this is still pending confirmation. The fog of war is thick, as they say, but on the Indian side, they have a mix of military hardware, a great portion of which actually comes from Russia. India and Russia have a long-standing defense relationship. But in recent years, India has also been diversifying and bringing in more military equipment from countries like France like Israel, and of course from the US as well. And so this is a situation, really one of the first of its kind, where we've seen Chinese origin hardware go up against some Western origin hardware. Maybe some Ukraine parallels there, but I think it's something certainly to keep an eye on, and that will have broader impacts for defense planners thinking about the Indo-Pacific and potential military conflict with China down the road.
So some useful information there on the balance of the two forces, Susi. Now tell us about the balance of the two nuclear arsenals. What do we know? Both countries are very secretive, aren't they?
They are very secretive, but fortunately, there's a lot of information available through satellite imagery, through different research that people have done. And I give a lot of credit to the Federation of American Scientists, who publishes the most definitive look at these arsenals. We know that both India and Pakistan have the ability to deliver nuclear weapons by air, land, and sea. That neither of them have a very strong component on the sea-based delivery. Pakistan's more for show, it's understood, but India is working on a second nuclear-armed submarine. But the thing that I worry about most are the missiles. And they both have a wide range of types of missiles. Some short range that go, 60 kilometers up to longer range missiles up to 5,000 kilometers. And India in particular has been working on developing a new series of these missiles, but both have invested significantly in their arsenals over the last few years. And what we find is that India spends maybe $2.5 billion a year on their arsenal, while Pakistan spends about $1 billion a year on their nuclear arsenal. They've invested significantly in increasing the capabilities of those arsenals, and that's always something to keep an eye on.
So, Dan, would you say these two countries are in a nuclear arms race?
Yes, I think that's fairly obvious. You can trace specific programs that they have where one is either trying to match the other side or counter it. So, for as an example of matching, Pakistan is trying to match India in the capability to put multiple and independently targeted warheads onto its missiles. India seems to have developed that capability. Pakistan is a bit behind. In terms of countering each other, as Susi was just saying, the Pakistan nuclear capability is quite missile heavy. We think that there are about 170 warheads in the Pakistan arsenal, and about 126 of those are on missiles. India's response is to have procured a Russian surface-to-air missile defense system for defense against medium-range missiles, and it's trying to develop that further. So I think you cannot get away from saying that there is a nuclear arms race at the moment. The arsenals are not large by global standards. 170 warheads each is a bit smaller than Britain's, that's smaller than France's, smaller than China's, way, way smaller than either Russia or the USA. But these are nonetheless significant armed forces, nuclear forces, technologically sophisticated and capable, as Susi has been rightly emphasizing, of doing a huge amount of damage, not just to the area where they land, but more broadly within the region. And as the radioactive dust goes up higher into the atmosphere, then it can move around the world and do further damage.
Elizabeth, what do we know in both countries about who can order a nuclear strike? Who has the launch codes?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that, again, as some of the others are saying, we don't have a great deal of clarity on the specific kind of nuclear football equivalent, right? The way that this works in the US is there's always an aide following around the president who has those launch codes. But in both sides, there are some interesting parallels, but also distinctions. So in India, civilian control is paramount. And so we see a stronger role for the civilians, or at least believe that to be the case in decision-making on nuclear issues, though obviously any decisions would be taken as part of a broader meeting that includes India's chiefs from across the armed forces. On the Pakistan side, Pakistan's military is hugely influential, and the army in particular. And so there are, of course, specific sections of Pakistan's armed forces that are charged with maintaining and building up its nuclear deterrent. And in Pakistan, the understanding is it's what's called the National Command Authority that would meet, of course, chaired by the prime minister, but with a strong presence of military officials and ultimately take decisions on nuclear issues. And so, in fact, as part of some of the signaling, the symbolic language that these two sides will exchange during these sorts of crises, we will see, for example, Pakistan convening a meeting of its National Command Authority. And so it's worth watching closely even that level of signaling, because there is an implicit association with potential nuclear use there.
Dan, we sometimes hear about the tactical use of nuclear weapons, tactical nukes as some sort of lesser evil. Are they?
No, in a word, I'm afraid not. Precisely because they're sometimes thought of as being a lesser evil, it makes them in some ways worse. It's arguable that one might think, a leader or a senior commander might think that this was a lesser option than a longer range missile strike. After all, you would not be hitting perhaps the capital, you would be hitting the local area where the combat is going on. But it opens the door to the next step up. And I think that one of the things to worry about in this is this idea that escalation is a process that one side or the other can control. It's actually really referred to as escalation originally because it's a process that might get out of hand. That's what the problem is. And Elizabeth just mentioned signaling, and people have talked and written for years about nuclear signaling and signaling with the use of nuclear weapons or with the deployment of nuclear weapons. The point is not what your intention is in the signal you think you're giving. The point is how it lands in the minds of the people on the other side. And then they think perhaps that this is, worse than you thought it was, so they escalate further. And you now think, wow, we did something really modest and they've hit back really hard. We need to show them that we're serious. And I think if there is a place in the nuclear arsenal where it might be most possible for there to be an ill-thought-through action and miscommunication and misinterpretation, it could well be in the shorter-range nuclear weapons. I think the one sort of thing that I've been looking at, nuclear dilemmas and nuclear problems for decades now. And one of the kinds of weapons that most worried me was nuclear artillery. And thankfully, there is no nuclear artillery between Pakistan and India. That doesn't mean there's no risk, but perhaps the greatest temptation for using nuclear weapons is perhaps a little bit removed. But yeah, tactical nuclear weapons, not an easy option, not a soft version of nuclear use.
Susi, I'm sort of looking at this and also looking at the historical timing of this, because in 3 months' time, it will be the anniversary of the last time nuclear weapons were used at the end of World War II in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And as you know, I know you were there in Oslo City Hall at the end of last year. I was there too when Nihon Hidankyo, the survivors of those attacks, were given the Nobel Peace Prize. Have we learnt any lessons at all?
I would like to think that we have, but that it's taken quite some time. Because if you think 80 years ago, nuclear weapons were invented, and they were invented, the first detonation was in July in New Mexico. And they were used twice in conflict, but they've been tested over 2,000 times. There are populations around the planet who are suffering the ill effects of the use and testing of nuclear weapons for the second generation, the third generation. One of the most profound things I thought in those events in Oslo was hearing not just from those who miraculously lived through that atomic bombing in August of 1945, but their children and hearing how they too have suffered from those weapons. You would think that we have learned, and we have learned enough to reduce the total numbers. We have learned enough that nearly 100 countries are on board a comprehensive prohibition, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, outlawing anything to do with nuclear weapons forever.
But Susie, none of those that have nuclear weapons have signed on to that, and that includes all the members of the UN Security Council. Dan, I mean, if you look at what happened in 1945, just compare for us. We don't know what could be used in any conflict. Let's hope there is no conflict. But compare that with the firepower that India and Pakistan have. What is the comparison?
If you took the total firepower, I think you would say that both India and Pakistan, or each of them, has in the vicinity of 80 times more firepower than was unleashed on Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. Of course, both of those attacks were deliberately on, or uses of the bombs, were deliberately on civilian targets, and so the towns, cities, and so the numbers of killed were then very high. But yes, the Hiroshima bomb is a modest size nuclear weapon in terms of the physical damage that it would do. As we've been saying, there are limitations to our knowledge about exactly what weapons India and Pakistan have, and some of them may be of a smaller nuclear yield, less power than the Hiroshima bomb. But they're in that vicinity of them, and they have 170 each, whereas the USA used 2 in 1945.
It's all very grim, Elizabeth. Try to give us something a little bit more optimistic at the end. Where do you see the possible off-ramps are? And briefly, which countries could potentially help mediate this?
Yeah, I think fundamentally the onus is on both India and Pakistan as parties to this crisis and potential conflict to recognize that neither has an interest in escalation. So both are facing security challenges, India from China, Pakistan from Afghanistan, and threats on its western border. And there are also economic imperatives here. War is hugely costly, and Pakistan has only just stabilized its economy, while India is seeking to build its out and achieve a global role. And so with those interests in mind, I think this is an opportunity that we have now for both sides to take a step back, to recognize that enough has happened, enough has transpired, that this is a potential window of opportunity to step back from the brink. And I was pleased to see reports coming out that communication had been established between the national security advisors on both sides. And we're also seeing the U.S., Gulf countries working the phones, calls from restraint from China and Russia. And, I think in the bigger global picture right now, there is so much going on, strained bandwidth and crises around the world. And so the last thing that we need is the situation like this to escalate. And so my hope is that essentially cooler heads will prevail because this is a very precarious situation.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all our guests today on Inside Story, Dan Smith, Susi Snyder and Elizabeth Threlkeld. Al Jazeera continues its coverage of the latest developments from both India and Pakistan around the clock. If you want more context and analysis, please visit our website, aljazeera.com. If you have any comments on this issue, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or post them on X, where we are at AJ Inside Story. From me, James Bays, and the production team here in Doha, please stay safe. Bye-bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.